While a lot of things are changing around us, I think that there's one thing that should not change. And that is really to make a priority of knowing Christ and working on our relationship with God. Sometimes when we go through difficult times, we have a tendency to forget that. And sometimes we can get distracted by some of the anxiety that we have and some of the fear that we have. And we get distracted from the main purpose of why God put us here on earth, and that was to know Him and to enjoy Him. And the coronavirus is not a reason to stop pursuing God. In fact, I would say the coronavirus is the reason that we should pursue Him even more. And I thought of one person that we could look at in this confusing time, and that is the Apostle Paul. In some ways, actually, Paul ended up in a situation very similar to ours. Right now, we are in lockdown, and Paul actually went through a time of lockdown as well. And he was locked down not because of an epidemic, but he was locked down because the Roman authorities put him into prison. And actually, his situation was a lot worse than ours, because in his lockdown, he could not go out and find food. He could not go out to the pharmacy. In fact, he was chained 24/7 to a Roman guard so that he could not go out. He didn't have a cell phone that he could contact people with. He didn't have the internet that he could entertain himself with. And so he was truly locked down. And what is interesting, it's from that book that he wrote while he was in lockdown called Philippians, that he wrote these words. He wrote, "I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation." How could he say that? How can you say that in lockdown the way he was? And then later on in chapter 4, he writes this. He says, "I will rejoice and I will keep on rejoicing." When I read that, it begs for me the question, what did Paul know about joy and contentment that we need to know while we're in lockdown? What was the secret to his contentment and to his joy? And I think actually the answer is quite simple. And it's this: what governed and controlled Paul's life was not his circumstances, it was not his anxiety, it was not his fear, but what governed and controlled his life was knowing Christ and focusing on His goodness and on His faithfulness and on His grace. That is why in Philippians, Paul says to rejoice in the Lord. It's in the Lord that we rejoice. And the ultimate grounds of our rejoicing can never be in our circumstances. And that's because our circumstances change. And when our circumstances change, that's when we become miserable. And so our delight has to be in the Lord Himself. And that's why we can never stop pursuing Him in our lives. Philippians has a lot more to say about joy and contentment. And I would challenge you this week that you would take the time to read that book. Right now, God bless. Stay safe.